Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing another Sharks player review. And next up, we have Sharks defenseman Radim Simek. And I was kind of hesitant of whether or not I actually wanted to make a video discussing Simek's performance here, because his impact on the season wasn't necessarily massive, and the amount of games he played was relatively close to the arbitrary, I admit, cutoff line of the 41 games played that I had actually established for these player reviews this season. And so I almost had included him in that video where I talked about players like Zetterlund, Jacob Peterson, Luke Cunnin, because he kind of really fit a bit more into that category. But Simek, I felt as though, had enough of a history with the San Jose Sharks to warrant his own actual video, to at least discuss sort of his journey to this point where he is more of a replaceable player and will likely be playing his final game or his final season in teal for the San Jose Sharks next season, if not potentially even being moved this off season. So let us indeed start with the history of Simek, and this doesn't go back to necessarily his first season with the Sharks in 18-19, but can actually go back a bit further than that to the 15-16 season. That was where the Sharks had kind of gone for like a quick retool. They had missed the playoffs in 14-15, got the 9th overall draft pick, picked up Timo Meier, then made a bunch of moves, signing they traded for Martin Jones, they signed Joel Ward, and in particular, they also signed Paul Martin, who would eventually end up on that first pairing with Brent Burns, and Brent Burns would blossom into that elite type of defenseman, one of the best in the league at that point in 15-16 and 16-17 with Paul Martin at his side. But in 17-18, Martin would kind of fall off. The Sharks would try to find somebody to fill in there, and while Joakim Ryan, who was really the choice at that point, was doing a decent job of stepping in, eventually in the playoffs when the Sharks would eventually lose in the second round to the Vegas Golden Knights, one of the issues that the Sharks had at that time was that they couldn't really find a decent performer on that top pairing with Brent Burns. Joakim Ryan not necessarily doing a great job, and when Paul Martin would eventually be put back in, it was quite clear that he was kind of over the hill in his NHL career, and I believe those were the last couple of games he played at the NHL level pretty much, and would eventually end up being retired and getting his contract bought out and all of those things. And so in 18-19, the Sharks would still try and go with Joakim Ryan, but it wasn't necessarily working out super well, and so who would fill in at that point but Radim Simek, and immediately make a wonderful impact with the San Jose Sharks, was doing a great job as the defensive pairing for Brent Burns. There at the time existed that statistics where when Simek was not in the lineup for the Sharks, they were kind of a middling team, not the best record, but when he was in the lineup, the Sharks were one of the best teams, one of the best records in the entire league, and Simek was just quickly becoming a fan favorite, even though he wasn't necessarily racking up 20 minutes, 25 minutes of ice time. When he was on the ice, things were quite solid, and Brent Burns was allowed to do what Brent Burns did best, and that's one of the big reasons for why he ended up having a career high in points that year. However, unfortunately, as the season would wear on, in the last couple of months, Simek would go down with an injury that would leave him out not just for the rest of the regular season, but for the entirety of the year, missing all of the playoffs for the San Jose Sharks, and that actually ended up being a pretty sizable issue for San Jose. This was the final chance, and the best chance perhaps, for the Sharks to actually get this Stanley Cup before this, maybe kind of hindsight is 2020 situation, but before the rebuild actually would end up starting. And the team that they would eventually lose to in the third round, the St. Louis Blues, the eventual Stanley Cup winners, was an extremely physical, maybe overly physical team, and Simek's presence at fully healthy would have absolutely helped maybe quell what the Blues were actually doing in that third round. And yet, because he was not there, and other injuries and other reasonings, of course, the Sharks would lose in that third round. So it was definitely a tough break for the Sharks as well as for Radim Simek, but he would of course return next season, and yet it never really would end up being the same. He never really got back to that 18-19 level, and while at the end of the 19-20 season he would get a contract with the Sharks, 4 years, $9 million, so that's $2.25 million per year, it felt as though he could never really live up to that value. And for the next few years, it was always like, well, Simek, he's making this money and he happens to be on the team, so I guess we kind of have to play him on this bottom pairing, even though he wasn't really worth it. And in particular, last season, he was a healthy scratch more often than not, so much so that I didn't even end up giving him a review last year. And this was something that kind of upset Simek. We saw interviews with him this past off-season talking about how he didn't like with the fact that he was so much of a healthy scratch. He thought he was playing well and yet just didn't really get the time of the day from from Bob Booner. And so this was an opportunity here for Simek to try and get a bit of a reset with this new coaching staff, with David Quinn, who, as we know, is quite sort of having the golden touch with some defensemen. A lot of Sharks defensemen really rebounding this year around: Vlasic, Karlsson, Matt Benning. And so it was definitely a chance for Simek. And yet, once again, it was a season mired with injuries. Simek, even though he's been with the Sharks for multiple years, has yet to play a season of more than 50 games, and this did not change. 44 games on the year. And while there were some healthy scratch thrown in here, there were also many injuries and many times where it was like, oh, he could come back from this injury if the Sharks had no better options, but they do, and so there's no reason to actually rush him back. And so he didn't necessarily get an opportunity to shine as much as he likely would have hoped for. But having said that, in the 44 games he did play, he certainly wasn't terrible. 1 goal, 2 assists for 3 points. Offensively, obviously doesn't jump off the page. This is exceedingly bad, even for a defensive defenseman, because it's on pace for like 5 or 6 points over a full 82-game season, but not necessarily for the lack of trying. You could definitely notice this year that Radim Simek was jumping a bit more into the play, and so I don't necessarily think the 3 points that he had fully reflects the amount of points he maybe should have had. Obviously, I'm not going to sit here and say, well, he could have had 30, 35 points, but could he have had like 10 in these games? Yeah, and at least 10 is slightly more respectable for like a bottom pairing guy. When it comes to his plus minus and his general defensive play, that was also decent enough. The fact is that he found himself a lot of the time, about 38% of his even strength ice time was with Mario Ferraro, and while I have yet to talk about Mario Ferraro in a player review, which is enough of an indication anyway of what I felt of Mario Ferraro this past season, it should be said that obviously, that's not necessarily the best pairing that the Sharks could have, because one of those players doesn't necessarily stick out in a super positive way, which I'll get to in a later video. But from a Simek perspective, I felt as though he didn't necessarily have the best type of teamwork help at those times. And so while minus 13 obviously doesn't look great for that third pairing defenseman, even on a bad team, I don't think it was all that horrible. And defensively, I thought he was decent enough compared to his expectations. Because remember, coming into this season, like with many of the Sharks defensemen, I wasn't necessarily expecting much more than like a 6th defenseman kind of guy, so that the fact that Simek met those expectations and maybe even slightly outperformed them is half decent. Then when it comes to his time on ice, about 14 minutes and a half, 14:37, actually pretty decent for a bottom pairing defenseman. You'll usually see those types of guys, let's say in the playoffs, drop down to like 10 to 12 minutes, but in the regular season, there's no reason to necessarily overplay your top guys. Plus the fact that besides Erik Karlsson, the Sharks didn't really have a natural hierarchy of defensemen. It was generally just like who was playing better at the time, which was frequently Vlasic and Benning, and then the fact that Ferraro got a ton of minutes for some reasons that are unknown. So Simek kind of falls down to that bottom pairing, but still 14.5 minutes, certainly not all that awful. And so when it comes to the grade for Radim Simek, like I said, didn't get a grade last season because of the fact that it felt as though he didn't really have much of an impact. And while he didn't have a huge impact this year, I did decide to go for the grade, and he slightly performed expectations and as such gets a C+. Class dismissed.